Number 5 on this list is Lord Combermere, or maybe better put as the ghost of Lord Combermere. The picture that we're going to look at today depicts the ghostly silhouette of the late Lord Combermere sitting in his chair. Insider writes, amateur photographer Corbet allegedly set up her camera and took this hour-long exposure while the funeral of her brother-in-law, Lord Combermere, was taking place 4 miles from the home. Interestingly, the apparition that appears to be sitting in the deceased Lord Combermere's chair is suggested to be Lord Combermere himself. I think the scariest part about this photograph is the timing. The fact that this was apparently captured literally right when the funeral for this man was being held. It's very possible that his spirit could have still been in and around the area and wasn't quite ready to leave the world of the living yet. Ghost Story UK says, it's thought by some that during that time a servant might have come into the room and sat briefly in the chair, creating the transparent image. This idea was refuted by members of the household, all testifying that they were all attending Lord Combermere's funeral. Sir William Barrett, who investigated the case and reported on it in the Journal of the Society for Physical Research, was not satisfied. Working on the theory that a manservant may have come in and seated himself in the chair, he took a test photograph and got a picture that was almost a duplicate of the Combermere photograph. The matter seemed ended, but as he told in his book On the Threshold of the Unseen in 1918, sometime later he received a letter from Lord Combermere's daughter-in-law about the photograph. She said that the face was always too indistinct to be quite convincing to me, though some of his children had no doubt at all of the identity. I may add, none of the manservants in the house closely resembled the figure and were all young men who were all attending the funeral. No one resembled him and everyone was out of the house when this photo was taken. For years the church and others have tried to explain this photograph, but they just simply can't. Maybe it was the ghost of Lord Combermere, or maybe it was a demon playing a trick on all of us. We may never know. Number 4 on this list is Freddy Jackson. In this photo, we're going to be looking at Sir Victor Goddard's Royal Air Force Squadron. This picture was taken in 1919 after World War I and showed a bunch of young strapping pilots. What's wild about this though is the unexpected visitor that we have in the back row. If we zoom into the top row and look at the man fourth from the left, we can see something over his right shoulder. An apparition of sorts that resembles a human face. After people started taking note of this and examined it, those who had worked with the squadron identified that face as Freddy Jackson. Freddy Jackson was a mechanic with this squadron for a while, but the crazy part is that he had died in a propeller accident several days earlier. Similarly to Lord Combermere, the day that this picture was taken was the day of his funeral. Maybe his ghost showed up because he was pissed all his friends were taking pictures and not paying their respects. But seriously though, how on earth do you explain a photo like that with tons of other people in it? It's impossible for it to have been staged, and it's clear that there's something there. Hopefully Freddy was able to find peace after his impromptu photo bomb. Number 3 on this list is the Aquia Episcopal Church. Heading back to Virginia with this one, this church is located in a place called Stafford. The church itself is rather beautiful and looks super unsuspecting. Some of the other churches on this list in our previous part just gave me the vibe that something was up, but this one doesn't. The outside and the inside make you feel homey and very safe. Problem is, this isn't the case. Only in your state writes, one of the most famous mysteries associated with the church is that of the golden-haired skeleton. No one knew about the death of the woman who was murdered inside Aquia until her skeleton was later discovered in the Belphegor, and her hair was later discovered in the Belfry. And her hair was still intact, just as blonde as the day she died. At the time, the church had lost funding due to the Revolutionary War, and that might have been the reason why no one discovered her body until later. The event seems equally tragic and mysterious. It's been said that bloodstains from the murder remained on the floorboard for nearly 100 years until it was replaced altogether with concrete. Not so surprisingly, many ghost stories worked their way through the community after the skeleton was discovered. Many parishioners refused to set foot in the church after dark. In the 1900s, people decided to seek evidence of hauntings for themselves. Many returned with chilling tales of having encountered an unfriendly presence. Even today, there's plenty of paranormal activity associated with the church grounds. Many visitors have reported hearing footsteps running through the graveyard accompanied by the sound of a violent struggle. Others claim to see the figure of a young golden-haired woman peering from the balcony window. So clearly this church has got a pretty dark history to it. It's said that the skeleton that was found was of a woman who was murdered by some men prior to the Revolutionary War. The church then closed for the war and reopened after it, so her body would have been stuck here decomposing for probably decades. It's no wonder that her soul hung on to this place and refused to let go. It's honestly really very sad if you ask me, because from all the reports that I read, her ghost isn't evil, it's just a lonely one. It's clear by the way she holds herself that she doesn't want to be stuck in this purgatory place, she just is. Similar to our monks, you should pray as a sign of respect before entering this church if you do ever go. Number 2 on this list is the lady in the lift. Whenever you step into an elevator, it feels as if you've stepped into a portal of some kind. If you really think about it, it kind of is a portal, considering you start on one floor and then finish on a different one. Now obviously there isn't anything magical about said elevators, and this portal of sorts is really just a mechanical innovation that takes you up and down tall buildings. That being said, this non-paranormal portal definition might not apply to the elevator in this photo. As we can see, there are a few people hanging out and chatting by the elevators. This was a picture captured by a doctor in a hospital in Bolivia. The elevator in the right of the image decided to open all by itself though. The group didn't think anything of it at the time, but when they looked back, noticed something fairly unsettling. The apparition of a woman is clearly standing in the elevator, staring right at them. No one knows who this woman is, but it's clear that she's either a ghost or a demon. Elevators have always seemed to have a connection to ghostly apparitions for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they do give off the sensation of being a portal, but there are a lot of stories connected to elevators and hauntings. This photo actually reminds me a lot of a haunted place in Austria. A young girl was at a university residence during Christmas. She was pretty much the only one who stayed there and didn't go home for the holidays. While she was there by herself, she accidentally stepped into the elevator shaft and fell to her death. Now she's set to haunt that elevator and torment those who step inside. Maybe this photo is of a similar story, but just at the hospital. It's impossible to say for sure, but either way guys, I'd be taking the stairs. And finally, number 1 on this list is the little boy. This photo is extremely scary and just flat out disturbing. BuzzFeed writes, the Reddit user who posted this image was deeply skeptical that there was anything paranormal going on, although they couldn't deny there is something chilling about the figure of a little boy staring out from the ruins of an old school. I grew up in a small rural town in between mountains. A couple years ago they were tearing down an old elementary school. A guy my mom knew went in and took pics with his cell phone. When he uploaded them, this was one of the pics. I don't believe in stuff like this at all, I just really don't know how to explain it since it was a cell phone pic, and I'm pretty sure that no one in my podunk hometown knows how to make fake pics. So maybe he doesn't know how, but I know how to explain it. You're in the ruins of an old school, and those ruins are haunted by the demon of a young boy. Sometimes the simplest answers are the right ones, and this to me looks like an example of that. This little dude 100% looks possessed, and you can't even really make out his legs. Nor can you actually see his arms either for that matter. Kind of difficult to make up a logical explanation for a kid with no arms and no legs floating in the middle of an abandoned school. Also, side note, but can you imagine being the one to take this picture? Like you turn a corner and you see that dude and your first thought is, I'm gonna pull out my phone and take a picture of this kid. Like if that's me, I am straight up running out of that thing and we're burning that building hot. Number 5 on this list is the farm demon. Most of the time we look at these photos and they're typically pretty old, captured 100 years ago and often chalked up as being a double exposure error or something like that. I don't think that can be said for the farm demon though. Stephen Wagner writes, this amazing photo was taken by photographer and graphic designer Neil Sandbach in 2008. Neil was photographing some scenic shots at a farm in England as part of a project for wedding stationery. The couple planned to have their wedding ceremony held there later. Neil was astonished when he examined the digital photo on his computer. There, as if peeking around a corner at him, is a ghostly white, almost glowing figure of what looks like a child. Neil says he's quite sure that there was no one there at the time. There's further corroboration that this is a true ghost photo. Neil had shown the couple the anomalous photo, and before the wedding they asked the staff at the farm if they'd ever seen any spooky experiences there before. They didn't mention Neil's photo. Indeed, they admitted that the figure of a young boy dressed in white night clothes had been seen on several occasions around the barn. So it looks as if this barn is haunted by some type of demon child, and Neil just happened to get lucky enough and capture it on camera. I think what's really scary about this though is that they had no idea it was there while they were staying at the farm, meaning that this demon child would have been stalking Neil the whole time. And what's even crazier than that is that this couple literally continued with the wedding. Like, scenery and all that quaint stuff is important, but a demon child running around the grounds? That's definitely a no-go wedding spot for me. Number 4 on this list is the demon pilot. In 1987, Mrs. Sayer and some of her closest friends were visiting Fleet Air Arms Station at Yeovilton, Somerset in England. As is customary with places that have a bunch of airplanes, you gotta take a photo of you inside of one as if you're flying it. Mrs. Sayer hopped into a helicopter that had been out of commission for a while, and she got her friends to take a snap of her while she was in it. The picture that came out was not what Mrs. Sayer or any of her pals expected though. When they took a look at the photo a while later, they saw what is a very clear image of a pilot sitting next to her. Actually, claiming that it's a pilot is a bit of a stretch. In truth, it's just a figure with a white shirt on that looks like a man. What this thing's connection to Mrs. Sayer or to the helicopter is anyone's guess. Apparently, when that photo was being taken, even though Mrs. Sayer had a bright smile on her face, she wasn't feeling so hot. In fact, she was feeling rather scared and anxious. She had no idea why at the time, and it was a passing feeling that went away after a few minutes, but just an overwhelming feeling of anxiety while she was there. To this day, nobody knows what this apparition is, what it's doing there, or what could have caused it to appear. Number 3 on this list is Beelzebub, another demon who is probably one of the most famous religious demons out there. Grunge says, Beelzebub, a demon with roots in old Philistine religions. His name comes up in the Bible a few times in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and he may be a stand-in for Satan, but another translation of Beelzebub is Lord of the Flies. John Milton's theory, described in Paradise Lost, is that he's a lieutenant of hell, second in power only to Satan, which is what folks in the industry refer to as Resume Gold. The starring role of Beelzebub's career is probably his part in the Salem witch trials, in which he was blamed for inhabiting the bodies of the accused. For anyone riding the fence on whether or not there was any real justice to be had there, it's worth looking at the writings of Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister in the area at the time. In his work of Beelzebub and his plot, Mather wrote that there is a devil in a thing doubted by none but such as are under the influences of the devil. If Beelzebub was actually real, then he is responsible for the death of tons of people due to all of the witch stuff that went down. Not to mention just the trials, but what sort of stuff did he actually make these people do? It could be any number of things that we still don't even know about today. For obvious reasons, the church was not too fond of this demon, but it wasn't just the church. Your average everyday individual wasn't too fond of him at all either. Like, think about it. Back in the day, you would have to worry about having Beelzebub come and get you, and then you'd be put on the stake for being a witch if he did. Now obviously, these witch trials were not done even remotely how they should have been, and it's unclear whether or not Beelzebub did or didn't play a role in them. But still, it doesn't change the fact that you would have been worried about him if you were alive back then. Number 2 on this list is the White Lady of Worstead Church. Similarly to our Pink Lady that we mentioned earlier, we have another vaporous demon ghost thing resembling that of a woman. In 1975, Diane and Peter Berthelot visited the Worstead Church in North Norfolk. Peter snapped a pic of his wife praying on one of the church benches. They didn't think anything about the photo at the time, just a cute day at the church, but months later, when they went to go get the film developed, one of their friends saw the photo and asked, "Who's that sitting behind you?" Behind Mrs. Berthelot is what looked to be the apparition of a woman wearing old clothes that were pretty much all white. This was obviously really spooky to the couple since they didn't remember anyone like that sitting behind her when they took the picture. They went back to Worstead Church the next summer and showed it to the Reverend. Apparently, this church for years now has been riddled by the spirit of the White Lady. It's said that this ghost demon is a healer who appears when someone near is in need of healing. When she visited the church at the time of the photo, Diane was in ill health and was taking antibiotics. Now, even though this ghost being is a healer, it can also curse you too. According to one story, on Christmas Eve in 1830, a man boasted a challenge to the White Lady. He said he would climb to the top of the church's belfry and kiss her if she would appear. So up he went. Hours went by and his friends got worried though. They went up to go search for him and they found him in the belfry, cowering in a corner, terrified. "I've seen her," he told them. "I've seen her." And then he died. The demon or ghost or whatever it is clearly capable of totally stunning you out of sheer fright. I personally can't imagine the feeling of literally dying out of fear, but that's what happened here, and it proves that this ghost, if that is what it is, has demonic qualities to it. Now, this church has been turned into a pub, believe it or not, but this presence still lingers. I'm all for getting a brew with the lads, but not at the expense of getting totally shell-shocked like that. Number 1 on this list is the Coventry demon. Stephen Wagner writes, on January 22nd, 1985, the Coventry Freeman organization were having a dinner event at St. Mary's Guildhall in Coventry, UK. Everyone in the group had her or his head bowed in prayer when this photo was taken, including a towering mysterious figure standing top left. The strange cowled spectre appears to be wearing clothes much like a monk frock from another time. Lord Mayor Walter Brandish, who was present at the dinner, said that there was no one at the event who was dressed like that, and he could not explain the presence of the interloper in the photo. St. Mary's Guildhall dates back to the 14th century and served as a prison for Mary, Queen of Scots. So as you guys can see, this creature doesn't look like anything human. I know that it resembles something like a monk, as Wagner was saying, but I also think that there's an argument that could be made that it resembles something from the underworld as well. The robes that it's wearing, coupled with the shape of its body, also coupled with the fact that no one actually saw this thing in person at all, kind of leads me to think that there must be something demonic about it. Also, the face doesn't look human at all. It's all black and those eyes don't look like human eyes. I have no idea why a demonic monk-looking creature would show up at this dinner event, but I also don't have any other explanation for why this thing popped up in the photo to begin with. Toss a comment down below if you have any theories on what this thing is or what it could be doing there in the first place.
Number 5. Slaw. Our first entry on this list is something called a slaw, which manifests as a bird, predominantly something like a raven or a crow. We all know corvids are the scariest classification of bird there is. It's Celtic in nature, which means almost certainly I am pronouncing that name wrong. It's probably something more like shra. They can take many forms, but prefer to do their hunting while donning the form of a corvid. What do they hunt exactly? Your soul. Your decaying soul, to be precise. These spirits seek out the dying, the weak, and stalk them, waiting like little carrion eaters. Not to worry, they also seek out the living too, waiting for the perfect time to strike. It's said that they seek out those who are experiencing heartbreak or intense emotional pain, so keep yourself in good spirits, I guess, lest you be attacked by the demon crows. The best way to avoid them, I can't believe this is what it said, but I looked it up, is to keep your windows and doors shut. Because, you know, they are birds. Stay inside and never say their name. Well, I probably should have read that part first, I guess. Sorry. Lore says that these demons were considered so evil and heinous that they were actually banned from hell. Imagine that. I did not even know that was a possibility. I thought hell was kind of where you kept all the most cruel spirits, but I didn't know you could be too hardcore for it. Love the image of Satan looking up at these birds and being like, "Get out! Scat, you!" These creatures come from ancient Irish folklore, where they were first thought to be dark spirits, or just plain old evil entities. But as the years went by, slowly the narrative shifted that these birds were the souls of sinners and damned cast out of hell. In the early 1900s, these creatures were sometimes attributed to mysterious deaths around Europe, predominantly Ireland and Scotland. It was said that when petty criminals and ne'er-do-wells would turn up dead inexplicably, it was the handiwork of these birds. These birds, I got scared to say their name. I don't want to mess with it. I'm just going to keep calling them these birds. These birds wait until your last tender moments on this earth, and when your soul is at its weakest, they swoop in and swallow your soul. What happens to a soul consumed by them? Well, I'm glad you asked. You become part of the flock, doomed to fly with them for the rest of time, feeding on other lost souls. But if spending eternity flying with a bunch of haunted ravens doesn't sound like your deal, I don't blame you. Why not spend eternity with the top 5 scary gang, and click through on the videos and watch forever and ever. Or maybe just an hour here and there. Toss a subscribe too while you're at it. Number 4. Jinninki. If you're familiar with the story of the Wendigo, and no doubt if you're watching Top 5 Scary, you're familiar with the story of the Wendigo because I can't go 3 minutes without shouting about the Wendigo, this spirit is very similar. It's sort of the Japanese Buddhist answer to it. The Jinninki are people who in life were terribly greedy, selfish, and now in death find themselves cursed to forever want more, to never be satisfied, and to also nefariously seek out human bodies to eat to satisfy their dark cravings. Yeah, just gonna slip that one under the door. They stalk in the nighttime, scavenging for freshly deceased bodies and food offerings that have been left out for the dead. It's said that they loot the corpses that they eat too, which I'm gonna be honest, seems remarkably rude. I can understand eating the flesh of a dead body, you know, you're an evil spirit, we all gotta do what we do. But I draw the line at looting. It's a whole other thing entirely to root through their pockets for spare change. Folklore suggests that they use the loot they scavenge off of their victims to bribe city officials to leave them alone to their dark dealings. I knew politicians were corrupt, but I didn't know they took bribes from ghosts. Jinkies, that's a whole new level. It's said that the Jinninki look like decomposing cadavers, with inhuman features like glowing eyes and sharp claws. Interestingly though, some local variants of the tale suggest that they're able to disguise their true nature. They only take this demonic form during the night when they're hunting, and during the daytime, they're able to blend in like any other regular human, perhaps to help them scope out their victims. Should you ever cross a Jinninki, their eyes will be able to give it away, as you'll see the red glow behind their eyes. And when you do, you'll find yourself frozen in fear. Number 3, Popa Bawa. Now that name might sound deceiving, cause to be honest, it does sound just the littlest bit cute. But this thing is the farthest thing from adorable imaginable. This terrifying demon hails from the island of Zanzibar in East Africa. If you don't know Zanzibar, it's where Freddie Mercury came from. Look it up, you'll learn something today. Popa Bawa is Swahili for batwing, referring to the creature's most common form that it takes of a giant, vaguely humanoid bat creature. But the bat form is just one of its many appearances that it can take. A Popa Bawa can take on whatever it pleases, and is more of a shadow creature than anything else, preferring to dwell in the darkness in a sort of formless way. Now, a shadowy, shape-shifting bat creature would already be enough horrifying qualifiers to land this spirit in a top 5 list of scariest spirits around the globe. But it's this next little tidbit that really earns its spot on this list. The Popa Bawa specifically targets victims who don't believe in it. So, if you don't believe in Popa Bawas, you better start. You're in one. That's not really how that joke went. It's thought to be behind the cause of an outbreak of hysteria through Zanzibar in the late 90s, when there were several reports through village after village of men reporting that they had been attacked in the night by this demonic creature. It got so bad that eventually villagers would resort to sleeping outside their homes, out of a belief that the creature wouldn't attack someone outside their house. Maybe there's like, I don't know, demon etiquette laws, I don't know. It's said that the Popa Bawa is hunting you if you can smell an intense smell of sulfur around your home. Mostly it comes out at night. Mostly. The way it gets you is particularly unpleasant. Instead of just like eating you or slashing or doing something normal that a normal monster would do, the Popa Bawa crushes you during the night by sitting on you. Ha! People who claim they've been attacked say they wake up in the middle of the night with an intense pressure on their ribs and chest and have trouble breathing. It's been said that if you ever suspect you've caught the attention of the Popa Bawa, the best way to rid yourself of it is to spread knowledge and tell everyone everything you know, because after all, it goes after non-believers. Not that, that's why I'm telling you all this now. I've been sleeping really good. My chest is doing fine. Number 2, Vetus. I'd never heard of this demon before doing my little research for this video, and let me tell you, it's a regret of mine that I didn't know about it earlier, because my life has been improved since knowing about this thing. Vetus is a demon whose main goal and pleasure in life is to convert good, pious, righteous people into nasty sinners so they can get pulled down into hell. It's hard enough trying to live a life free of sin without demons also trying to trick me into damning my eternal soul. I already can't walk down the street without coveting 3 things in a window. Now I gotta deal with this? Luckily for me, Vetus probably wouldn't be terribly interested in me, since swaying me with sin is remarkably easy. He goes after priests, members of the cloth, people of devout faith. It's like his job to take charge of the really tough cases to tempt towards sin. He's a master of deception, seduction, trickery, bribery, intimidation, and a whole lot of other nasty demon business that probably looks good on his Tinder profile. Where he gets kind of wild though is that apparently he only ever talked in rhyme, which was supposed to help him lull you into a sense of comfort that causes you to trust him and makes you more likely to sin. I don't know about rhyme making me sin. That's Feels like what they said would happen if I listened to rap music. Besides his freestyling bars, Vetus is a shape-shifting demon capable of taking whatever form he pleases, but he prefers to take forms that are wooden in nature, like a cursed tree or something for example. He's also depicted as often having many limbs, growing outwards and fractal like a spider might. Most insidiously about all that Vetus does is that he stares deeply into your soul and sees your deepest, darkest, most sinful desires, meaning he has definitely read my Frasier fanfiction. Vetus then, with his conjuring and shape-shifting, makes your desire manifest in reality, where he can tempt you with sin up close and personal to see just how truly committed to the path of the righteous you are. And finally, coming in number 1 at the list is Malik. Perhaps you've heard the name before. Malik is an old god, real old, like Old Testament old. Malik takes the form of an impressively sized deity with the head of a cow or bull instead of man, and usually he has his arms stretched outwards towards a fire in most statues or paintings of him. This is because this was his preferred method of sacrifice. Whatever you were to offer him, usually human, were to be cast into the flames for Malik's pleasure. He's thought to be a pagan fertility deity, mentioned across various religious texts and worshipped by the Canaanites. Moses forbade the Israelites to worship Malik, as he was a false god. Malik quite enjoyed sacrifices and being paid homage, and it's said that this was always to appease his wrath. In Paradise Lost, the epic poem that fleshed out much of what we know and think about hell, Malik was described as being a fallen angel and one of Satan's greatest warriors. This depiction paints him as a bloodthirsty soldier of hell who is eager to spur a war against heaven's forces, and he is worshipped as a deity specifically to anger God above. Sounds like he makes lovely company. Number 5, Pazuzu. Our first terrifying demon up on this list has made quite the career for himself in pop culture. He's picked up some small gigs here and there. He's serving as a sort of mascot of sorts for the real fake band Gorillaz, multiple cameos on Futurama, and won some acclaim for his star-studded role in The Exorcist, possessing Reagan and making us all afraid of pea soup. Although his real historical background is far more interesting than any of his pop culture appearances. Pazuzu has been around for a long time, first being recorded as a Babylonian demon wind god, who was always playing both sides so he'd come out on top. He was a god of wind, and it was thought that the wind ravaging, storms, and locusts were all byproducts of Pazuzu's rage. But he was also thought to be a protector. He would protect the home, taking a particular liking to watching over pregnant women. He was an incredibly destructive force in nature, and when it would come time to throw down, Pazuzu would fly across the world, breaking the wings of other demons to prevent them from getting into any trouble. Sort of like a demonic Batman. His portrayal in The Exorcist is probably where most people know him from and assume those things about him, where he's seen as a much more plain Jane possessing demon, lacking his impressive wings and other traits, and not doing a whole lot of flying around or anything with the wind, focusing a lot more on projectile vomiting and harassing a couple of priests. The real Pazuzu is a lot cooler than his Exorcist appearance, but no doubt more people know about that than they do an ancient Babylonian wind god. I don't think I'd like to spend much time with either incarnation face to face, and those priests definitely didn't want to either. Now ghouls, goblins, lend me your ears, and subscribe if you wouldn't mind. Number 4. Belphegor. Now another demon who's had his moment in pop culture. Maybe you recognize Belphegor from Supernatural's first fledgling season, all the way back when the boys were wide-eyed and hadn't even died once yet. Or maybe if you're a Persona fan, you recognize Belphegor as the perpetually bored demon on the can. It's a video game with a talking cat, and you play as a guy who's got a healthy sleep schedule and can manage his social circle well. It's not a game focused on realism. But it turns out, doing a little research, there was a reason for this foul demon's appearance. One of the 7 princes of hell, the demonic icon of Sloth's favorite offering isn't blood or a fresh goat, but a little mud pie, feces if you want to get scientific with it. Look, I'm not going to judge, and I'm not going to ask what he's doing with it. Old lore just says that if you wanted to summon Belphegor, you had to bring him a lot of feces. There's no metric volume ever listed, just a lot. If you do summon him, he'll trade you wondrous riches, expand your ability to discover new things, expand your consciousness, but at the cost of the temptation of your mortal soul, and you'll also probably never be able to wash your hands clean again. I'm sorry, I don't usually work so blue. It's the lazy man's comedy, although perchance that's fitting for the demon prince of Sloth. Belphegor has been depicted in all manner of ways over the years, appearing sometimes as esoteric things like tree branches, or sometimes taking the form of beautiful women. But one wood carving in the 18th century of him sitting on an 18th century John sealed his fate pretty much forever, and then since then, he's almost always been depicted as a horned demon sitting on a throne of sorts. Belphegor, I want to make something clear here. I'm not making fun of you. I'm trying to make sense of all this. Number 3, the Legion. Now, this next demon is a tiny bit of a cheat because although it's supposed to be a top 5 list, I'm about to make it a top 500,000 list. This next demon is known as the Legion, for it is many. The Legion's first documented recording is from the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus Christ encountered a man possessed by a demon. When he spoke to the man in an effort to exorcise him, he asked for the name of the demon inside him, and the man responded, Legion, for there were many devils inside him. Upon being exorcised from the man, the Legion asked if it could instead be transferred to a herd of pigs, which he then obliged. Now the Legion is pretty atypical when it comes to demons. It's not the prince of anything, it's not the manifestation of any one sin, and it's not any one thing at all. The Legion is made of countless demons that all function together in unison like a hive mind. When one has a thought, the rest of the Legion obeys. When one member of the Legion speaks, the rest of them speak all at once. Now sometimes the armies of Satan are referred to as the legions of hell, but I guess the Legion is a separate thing altogether. It must make filling out forms very difficult. No one's really sure what sort of demons the Legion are or what they look like even. It's just agreed that there's a lot of them all working together on their common goals. Like I said, no one really knows what they look like, but if you've ever seen a horde of, anything all in one place, you can't imagine that it would be anything pleasant. Now the Legion isn't as much of a pop culture starlet as some of the other demons I've mentioned on this list, but that doesn't mean that it's influenced things in pop culture. The phrase Legion, for we are many, appears in all sorts of different things, probably because it's just a very cool way to describe yourself. A recurring boss fight in the Castlevania video games called Legion appears as a writhing mass of bodies, no doubt inspired by the story. And the character in Mass Effect named Legion is an AI life form comprised of thousands of individual AI working in tandem, who directly references the story, introducing itself, saying, "We are Legion, for we are many." And while I'm on it, Legion was the entire best character in Mass Effect, but that's neither here nor there. Sleep easy, big guy. Number 2, Beelzebub. Now we're getting into the big hitters. Beelzebub is thought to be one of the first angels to have ever fallen to hell, alongside Leviathan and Lucifer himself. He and Lucifer actually have a bit of an identity crisis, as the two are sometimes thought to be interchangeable. They must have similar haircuts. Some demonologists argue that Beelzebub is another name for Lucifer, and some others pose that he's one of his most trusted lieutenants. But whatever Beelzebub is, everyone can agree that he's pretty horrifying. His history is fairly interesting. It's thought that his namesake is a mockery of the god Baal, an ancient Bronze Age god of fertility. Some scholars believe that Beelzebub's name comes from Baal-zebub, translating to Lord of the Flies, inferring that the followers of Baal are nothing more than flies worshipping a dung god. They didn't get the memo that Belphegor was the dung god. The Lord of the Flies sort of ended up becoming Beelzebub's title, with almost all depictions of the demon featuring flies in ubiquitous amounts around him. Occasionally he's even depicted as a giant fly. It's very Kafkaesque. Beelzebub is said to be one of the most powerful demons inside of Hell's domain, capable of great control over humanity, able to tempt them. Beelzebub was cited during the Salem witch trials as the entity that had corrupted and swayed so many women to witchery. Now there's some discrepancy as to what sin Beelzebub is thought to preside over, with some offerings saying that he represents pride, some others saying that he represents gluttony, which I would say probably seems a little more fitting for a fly demon anyway, and he's most commonly associated with gluttony. Number 1, Asmodeus. Yeah, it probably would have made a lot of sense to have Lucifer as the number 1 spot on this list. I mean, he's the king of hell and all that. So let's just take this moment, give him an honorable mention, and say he's at the number 0 spot, just because I thought it was a little obvious, and I'm pretty sure you know who Satan is, and there's other demons we could talk about, bring up some unknown ones. So filling in at the number 1 spot is Asmodeus, one of the princes of hell and the embodiment of the cardinal sin of lust. Asmodeus fell from heaven alongside the other fallen angels, reforming as a prince of hell. Asmodeus is said to have been married to Lilith, the primordial she-demon, famed for her banishing from the Garden of Eden and famed for destroying Fraser Crane. Lilith was cursed and banished for her defilement and depicted as a temptress, and Asmodeus saw all that and was like, "Hey girl, I'm into all that stuff. You want to procreate an endless stream of demons into the world and reign over a dominion of chaos? and the rest is wedded bliss. Depictions of Asmodeus vary pretty wildly from case to case. Occasionally, he's drawn as a handsome young fella, but most commonly he's depicted as a squat, vaguely humanoid creature with a rooster leg, the tail of a snake, 3 heads, comprising of a bull, a goat, and a scruffy demon head as the center. Asmodeus presides over lust with the help of his beloved Lilith, and the two tempt humans with madness and desire to ruin people with lechery. Somehow this wasn't enough for Asmodeus though, as some stories also describe Asmodeus as having command over the betting halls of hell and is responsible for tempting man's souls towards gambling. So what I am hearing from this is that Asmodeus probably parties harder than any demon out there. Number 5. Mammon. There's nothing wrong with wanting a little, right? It's nice to want. Nothing better than having a little money and power. For most of us who weren't born into a Fortune 500 lineage, it might be a little bit tricky unless you got a little bit help. Maybe like from Mammon, the embodiment of human greed. You know, he's actually a lot more generous than his position as greed demon might suggest. You know, you don't have to do too much. If you just give over your eternal soul and pledge yourself to an eternity in his service, he might reward you with great riches. That's a pretty solid transaction. Mammoth is thought to originate from an ancient word for wealth, and it's thought that this is where Mammon was first born from. He was mankind's inherent desire for wealth and greed, twisted out of subconscious want. The Gospel of Luke and Matthew both directly quote this, saying, "You cannot serve both God and Mammon," meaning you can't have a pious life and also find yourself on a quest for massive wealth, and later taken literally to mean you can't serve one of the 7 princes of hell if you worship God. Mammon is greedy. Makes sense? He's real greedy. It's said that of all the archdukes and princes of hell, Mammon is more concerned with staring at the gold pavement than any of Lucifer's rebellion or business of the heavens, taken to mean that Mammon doesn't really concern himself with anything that doesn't involve cold, hard coin. He is on that grind set 24/7. The demon of greed has taken many forms over the years, with his most consistent depiction being that of a fairly normal-looking humanoid, looming over his subjects in a giant golden throne, looking down on those who would call for his aid. He's also associated with a wolf, and is believed to be able to take the form of one for his dealings on Earth. It's said that part of the arcane ritual to evoke Mammon's spirit is to imagine your spirit as a golden wolf calling out to him. If you do invoke Mammon, just be sure you're being reasonable with what you ask for. You never know what happens if you get too greedy. Beelzebub. It's said that when the rebellion began, Lucifer fell from heaven and was cast out alongside the other fallen angels. Well, who were the lesser known fallen angels? Beelzebub is an obscure demon, but a threatening one nonetheless, and a very difficult name to pronounce. In the Testament of Solomon, the demon Beelzebub introduces himself as a threat to God's will, and anyone who serves God. Beelzebub rules over some dominions of hell, serving as one of Lucifer's trusted lieutenants. He was originally an angel, but unhappy, and when cast out with the rest of them, fell to earth, disfigured and vengeful. As he fell out of the kingdom of heaven, the other angels desperately grabbed at his wings to try and retrieve him. But instead of restraining him, the process ripped his wing from his back, leaving Beelzebub with a singular, dark, monstrous red wing. Although, I doubt he minds much, because to be honest, that sounds sick as all hell. It probably works really well for his demon aesthetic. Beelzebub presides over the pits of Tartarus, a unique dimension in hell originating from Greek mythology as a depth of the underworld. Beelzebub is a powerful sorcerer, boasting to King Solomon that he's far superior to the prophet Moses in every way. He brags of his sorcery and magic, being able to shift ideas and human perception in his favor, conjuring miracles, wonders, and form signs to humans, and is even able to bestow his gift to humans in exchange for favor. Beelzebub takes a particular personal pleasure in torturing God's servants out of his twisted malice for the heavens above. Thankfully, Beelzebub's cruelty was his undoing. When Moses parted the Red Sea, Beelzebub wanted to be there to see it in person, or in demon, I guess. When the Red Sea closed yet again, Beelzebub was trapped inside a pillar of air. But Beelzebub is confident he will return again. Number 3. Samael. Samael is one of the more interesting entries on this list, namely because depending on the text cited, he's either an archangel of heaven or a fallen angel serving in hell. Angels to some, demons to others, and all that. He's often referred to as the original Grim Reaper, and is thought to be where depictions of the Soul Collector stem from. Samael across most texts is known as the Angel of Death, a title that precedes itself. I mean, you hear the Angel of Death and you know I probably should not be messing with that guy, because I'm pretty sure they also call John Wick that sometimes. It's said that on the hour of a person's final release from this mortal coil, Samael will descend upon them, wings extended and sword drawn, dripping at its tip the poison that takes your life. Samael's name actually translates to Venom of God, again, in case you're wondering just how nice this guy is. Samael is known as the Accuser, the Seducer, the Destroyer, and a Midnight Joker. Samael's role as the Seducer is an essential one to the Kingdom of Heaven. He's seen as good and evil in the same measure, but he is only serving God's will. Tempting mankind is Samael's lot in life. It's been said as well that Samael is the one who planted the tree of knowledge and was the serpent who tempted Adam and Eve to bite the fruit. When Abraham was tested by God to sacrifice Isaac, it was said that Samael was the one who whispered into their ears to disobey. It's said that his ultimate goal is to bring an end to death itself, including the very concept of it. Once he's finished his ultimate mission, he'll be annihilated himself, and with death undone, his mission complete. Number 2. Mephistopheles. Imagine you could make a deal for whatever you wanted, no matter how outrageous the request. Power, influence, romance. If all it took was your soul, would you do it? Well, that's the offer Mephistopheles is prepared to make you. One of the most sinister servants in hell, Mephistopheles, or Mephisto as he's sometimes referred to, is one of Lucifer's right-hand men. Responsible for bargains and deals involving human souls, Mephistopheles takes a great sickening pleasure in luring wayward souls downwards to the underworld. If Mephistopheles has already made himself present to you, I'm afraid it's already too late to you. He doesn't go out of his way to corrupt and tempt the innocent the way other demons do, but rather he finishes the job for those who've already begun to falter on a path they can't return from. In some instances, Mephistopheles' role changes slightly. Sometimes he appears to trick people into damning themselves. In others, they're already damned and he's just finishing off the inevitable. Most famously is the legend he originates from, where the bet he places with Faust for his soul, the protagonist of the ancient German legend, who made a deal at a crossroads with Mephistopheles. In exchange for ultimate power and the servitude of Mephistopheles while Faust lives, when he passes, Faust's soul will become the property of Mephistopheles and he will enslave him and damn him for eternity. Faust got what he was promised, and the terms Faust and Faustian now became synonymous with hard bargains out of this legend. Mephistopheles knows that he's essential to the cycle of the world. He knows that as much as we hate him, we need him. He tells Faust that he's part of the dark chaos that gives birth to the light. Sure, he's offering people in exchange for eternal damnation for mortal goods, but he is inspiring people in his own twisted little way. He's trying to get you to do better so you won't hear him knocking. Number 1. Leviathan. As far as demons go, who's a bigger threat than the Leviathan? I mean, how could there even be a bigger threat? Leviathan, it's in the name. Just let that sit in your mouth for a bit and think of something big. Leviathan is thought to be the embodiment of the sin of envy, and he is one of the princes of hell, and the grand admiral of hell's armies. It's tasked with pushing man towards temptation and the sin of heresy. Leviathan manifests itself as a behemoth of a creature, an incomprehensibly large sea serpent that would make H.P. Lovecraft blush. It's said to have impenetrable armored scales all over its body, and has monstrous claws as well, capable of destroying anything it would ever have to battle against, should that ever arise. It's said that it can conjure up mighty bursts of flame from its chest like a dragon. Leviathan serves as the gatekeeper of hell, with the mighty demon's very jaws serving as the gates to the underworld themselves. Said as well that Leviathan's own flesh makes up the foundations for the walls of hell, and it feasts upon souls that attempt to escape the underworld. Foolishly, of course. As far as demonic power levels go, making up the literal corners of the underworld have got to count for something. How many demons can claim to be so hardcore they practically are hell? I can see why he's such a trusted lieutenant.
Number 5 on this list is Hallstatt Karnar. Hallstatt Karnar is one weird church, man, let me tell you. I'm all about unique and cool decorations, but human body parts? kind of where I draw the line, guys. Discovery.com says, many bone churches and ossuaries are decorated with femurs and pelvises, but at Hallstatt these skulls themselves are decorated. More than 600 of the skulls on display in this Benhaus, also known as Bone House in English, bear their former owners' names, professions, and the date of their death. Many are also adorned with decorative garlands and flowers. But perhaps what makes this bone church stand out the most is the fact that the most recent remains to be interred here belong to a woman who passed away in 1983 after having requested the Benhaus as her final resting place. What's more, she might not be the last because the church is still open to receiving similar requests. So yeah, the dark secret here is that there is literal bones still being added. 1983 is really not that long ago when you think about it, and like the article suggests, that's probably not the last person to have been thrown into this array of skeletons. I guess it isn't, but it feels like this should be illegal or something. At the very least, it's just super weird. Like, why is a bunch of dead bodies and bones and stuff bringing anyone closer to God? Isn't the whole point of church to connect with your spiritual side? Not get grossed out by a bunch of dead people who you might have even known at one point. The church is located in Austria and has got to be one of the scariest churches in that country for sure. Unless you want your bones to be added to some religious display, I would stay away from this place. Number 4 on this list is the St. Louis Cathedral, a beautiful church like many on this list, which is riddled with spirits. List first says, like the city it serves, the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans is a font of strange myths and legends. Originally built by the city's French rulers, the modern cathedral wasn't completed until the 1850s. According to lore, the ghosts of the old structure came along for the ride. One of the cathedral's better known ghosts, Père Dagobert, was an 18th century priest. Dagobert was renowned for his kindness, especially his willingness to treat the poor and terminally ill. During the 1760s, several members of his congregation decided to revolt against the city's new Spanish rulers. The mainly French and Creole rebels successfully pushed the initial Spanish force out of the city, but a larger force later managed to claim New Orleans for the Spanish king. Infuriated by the earlier rebellion, Irish-Spanish governor Alejandro O'Reilly decided to not only execute the rebels, but also leave their rotting bodies on the doorstep of the St. Louis Cathedral. As a devout Catholic, Dagobert could not stand by while Catholic bodies were so roughly treated. After failing to get O'Reilly's permission to properly bury the bodies, Dagobert led a funeral procession down to St. Peter's Cemetery and placed the slain men in unmarked graves. Dagobert's successor, a Spanish priest named Pierre Antoine, is also said to haunt the cathedral. More intriguingly, Antoine's friend, voodoo priestess Mary Laveau, who often prayed at the church during her lifetime, is also considered to be one of the many spirits inside the cathedral. So we got voodoo priestesses, unmarked haunted graves, multiple spirits of bodies that were buried improperly. This church is just one big mess. Many people think that there are also a bunch of other secrets that this place has that we don't know about. Like this was a spot for a secret society hundreds of years ago who performed some very questionable rituals, and that's why this place is as haunted as it is. Whatever really happened here, we know it was dark and we know that it left its mark. Number 3 on this list is Nidaros Cathedral. Located in Norway, this is referred to by locals as the most important Norwegian cathedral and also the most haunted. Taking a look at this thing on the outside, it's certainly very beautiful, but also gives me some serious haunted vibes. And those vibes are well founded. The church was finished being built in 1300 and is directly in the center of the city of Trondheim. It's certainly been around for a large part of Norway's history, however the hauntings at this church have been pretty recent relative to how long it's been around. It all started in 1924 when Bishop Mary Gleditch saw something pretty scary and gruesome. The ghost of a monk who had a massive slash directly across his neck. This monk has been spotted haunting the church ever since, but the weird thing is, nobody knows why. Historians have combed through Norway's history and can't seem to find a time that any order of monks would have stayed at this church. Now at the end of the day, this doesn't mean that having a ghost monk is impossible by any means. It's totally possible that a singular monk just happened to be at this church for some reason and through some tragedy died, or by the nature of that cut was potentially murdered. Whatever his reasoning for being there, he certainly is. Many visitors have spotted him, and some have said that they've seen him playing the organ in the church before. I personally can't imagine stumbling upon a monk whose throat is totally cut playing the organ. This is definitely one that deserves a prayer before entry. Number 2 on this list is St. Nicholas Church. Hey, it's me. It just so happens that my church is haunted by a dozen spirits. Great. List first says St. Nicholas Church is practically haunted by default. That's because the village of Pluckley, its home, is reputably the most haunted locale in all of England. The Kent village is home to the Watercress woman, who occupies the Pinnock Bridge, and to the ghost of a schoolmaster who committed suicide in front of his pupils. According to a conservative estimate, Pluckley contains no fewer than 12 active spirits. The church itself is said to be the home of both the beautiful ghost of Lady Daring and the Lady in Red, a ghost who searches the adjacent churchyard for her lost baby. The ghost of a former miller who worked in the area is also said to haunt the churchyard in search of a long-lost love. Also, the ghost of a monk at nearby Greystone's house is also said to be seen during the night. Finally, visitors to St. Nicholas have reported seeing lights in the church's windows when no one was inside. So we have another church with just a plethora of horrible things. Someone taking their own life, a missing a man who has lost his loved one. My question is, why did all of this happen at this one church? Like, what really caused all of this to transpire in the first place? Are we just supposed to believe that it's all coincidence, or is there actually something more afoot here? I think that's the real secret, and sadly, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to find the true answer. And finally, number 1 on this list is St. Andres on the Red. Just that name alone, on the Red. Like, of course this place had to have some dark secrets. List first says St. Andrews on the Red, completed in 1849, is located in the town of Selkirk, which is more or less a suburb of Winnipeg. It's the oldest stone church in Western Canada, and it may be the region's most haunted thanks to the spirits of former plague victims. Other apparitions are said to populate the church's graveyard. Eyewitnesses have reported seeing a ghostly man clad in black and a mysterious woman in white. Also, a disembodied pair of red eyes have startled the visitors in the past, while a ghost car has been noted not far from the church's main entrance. If you're thinking about visiting the church or graveyard, be wary. Those who've claimed to have seen the various apparitions also reported having terrible nightmares the following nights. Most of these nightmares apparently involved the gates of the cemetery, which rattle even though no hands are seen shaking them. Some people can't shake these nightmares either. The occasional individual will have these persist for months or even years. I'm sure that the architecture and natural beauty is nice and all, but I'm not trying to risk nightmares for a year to see it. I do wonder what happened to those gates though. Is it some weird thing with the wind that's causing it, or is it what people suggest, some type of ghostly intervention? I tend to think some sort of spirit has to be involved, considering the thing with the nightmares happens as well, but you gotta wonder who. Sometimes I really do think that being a paranormal investigator would be awesome, because you could get to the bottom of these things, but then again, that's a pretty unforgiving profession. Number 5 on this list is Pelagius. Pelagius lived around 390 AD, and although very little is known about his personal life, we do know that the church was really not happy with his theological teachings. The Catholic gentleman says, Pelagianism radically corrupted the church's teachings on grace, sin, and the fall. Its namesake, the British monk Pelagius, taught that the sin of Adam had no bearing on subsequent generations. Essentially, man was inherently good and unaffected by the fall. In practice, this meant that a man could come to God by his own free will with no grace needed. Many saints fought against this doctrine. Saint David of Wales stands out among them especially, but it was Saint Augustine of Hippo argued arguably the greatest of the Latin doctors, and the church's mightiest champion against heresy, who rose to fight against this inherently venomous strand of thought. Against Pelagius, St. Augustine upheld the truth that God's grace is entirely necessary for any movement of ours towards God to occur at all. As he himself puts it, we, for our part, assert that the human will is so divinely aided towards the doing of righteousness that, besides being created with the free choice of his will, and besides the teaching which instructs him how he ought to live, he receives also the Holy Spirit, through which there arises in his heart a delight in and love of that supreme and unchangeable good which is God. And this arises even now, while he still walks by faith and not by sight. Everything about Pelagius's teachings went against what the church wanted. They wanted and believed that people needed to be committed to God through them, but what this man was teaching was kind of going against that. This scared the church a lot because it was undermining their power to act as the medium for the average human being and God. Therefore, Pelagius had to be stopped. There's no record of him being executed, but we do know that at one point he had to flee Rome and go into hiding to continue his work. Number 4 on this list is Asmodeus. Asmodeus is actually a demon, and whether or not he is real can definitely be debated. But what can't be debated is how scared the church was of him. Grunge says the demon known as Asmodeus appears in the book of Tobit, a Judeo-Christian book of the Bible that's either religious canon or apocrypha depending on which branch of Christianity you subscribe to. Asmodeus is said to be the worst of the demons. He doesn't hesitate to kill, and he has what has to be the lamest, most specific Achilles heel in the history of monsters. In the book of Tobit, there's a young woman named Sarah who would very much like to be married. She becomes engaged, gets married, and then right before the sweet consummating, Asmodeus shows up and kills her husband. What might seem like a fluke quickly becomes a trend, as this happens to Sarah a total of 7 times. On lucky number 8, Sarah, who must have been an amazing conversationalist for this many guys to roll these dice, marries a guy named Tobias, who the Archangel Raphael gives the scoop on how to beat Asmodeus. The demon appears on the wedding night, and Tobias tosses a fish's heart and liver onto some coals, causing smoke that triggers Asmodeus's asthma or something like that. Asmodeus scampers off, and Raphael tracks him down, ties him up, and strangles him. So luckily for us, the text says that there's no more of Asmodeus, but that doesn't mean that his evil spirit doesn't still linger on. This is a demon that we're talking about here, and one of the worst ones ever at that. So I wouldn't be surprised if getting rid of this guy for good is a pretty hard thing to accomplish. Also, just a sidebar here, but poor Sarah, eh? This lady's just trying to get married and literally has to do it 8 separate times before one finally sticks. I think after marriage number 3, I'd personally just call it quits and get a puppy or something. Number 3 on this list is Greyfriars Kirkyard. As the name Greyfriars might hint, this church is located in Scotland. History Hit says, with the kirk tracing its origin to 1598 and the graveyard dating back even further to the 1560s, Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh is said to be one of the most haunted religious sites in the world. Known for body snatching and violent ghosts, the famously fearsome site has even been referred to by Scottish poet Robert Louis Stevenson. The site's most famous ghost is the Mackenzie poltergeist. George Mackenzie, who was known during his lifetime as a ruthless persecutor of Scottish Covenanters, a Presbyterian movement in the 17th century. His spirit was reportedly released in 1999 when a homeless man looking for somewhere to sleep broke into his final resting place, the Black Mausoleum. Next to this mausoleum is the former Covenanters prison, which housed some 1,200 members of a failed anti-government revolution in 1679. Only 257 prisoners came out alive, with the remaining dead said to haunt the churchyard. Kirkyard. The negative energy that surrounds this church is said to be so strong that it's attracted some pretty powerful beings. The devil is the one being that people associate with this place. Some believe that this church is actually a secret lair for the devil, that these other demonic spirits are working to keep us away from this place so the devil can fulfill his evil agenda. If this is the case, then I think that we should do as the devil wants and leave it alone. Number 2 on this list is Arianism. Arianism wasn't a person necessarily, but a full-on train of thought by many different people that the church was extremely scared of. The Catholic gentleman says, aside from the various Gnostic sects that plagued the early church, it is in Arianism that is arguably the most famous of all Christian heresies. It struck at the very root and core of Christian teaching that Jesus was God himself in the flesh and relegated the person of Jesus Christ to that of a mere created thing. It lives on today in varying forms, from well-known sects like the Jehovah's Witnesses all the way to the bizarre world of Apollo Quilaboy. Moreover, it still lurks within the sentences of some modern theologians who ambiguously state that Jesus is the Christ, but no more than an exalted man. Saint Athanasius of Alexandria was the walking cure for this heresy. Stubborn and unshakable, I think it not a stretch to say at times that this great man stood alone against wave after wave of Arian attacks on the truth of the Christian faith. By emphasizing and stubbornly holding to the truth of Christ as both God and man, Saint Athanasius effectively ended the reign of the Arian heresy within the church. At the root, Arianism is basically the thinking that instead of being born, Jesus was created by God. This obviously goes against a lot of what the church teaches and believes in, and therefore they weren't too fond of this thinking or anyone who thought it. Pretty much anybody back in the day who did wholeheartedly believe this was condemned as being a heretic, and some bad things would be coming down the pipe if that was you. And finally, number 1 on this list is the devil. This one seems obvious, but just because it's obvious doesn't mean that we shouldn't include it on the list. The devil has always been the one to blame for any evil that is plaguing the earth. A great famine takes the lives of thousands of people. The devil did it. Someone loses their minds and kills a bunch of people. They must have been taken over by the devil. My coupon for 20% off on hot wings expired a week ago. Must have been the devil. Obviously, everyone was scared of the devil if he came for them. The church was scared of it, and the average person was scared of it. What is really interesting to me, though, is that the devil, even though he is horribly scary, is actually necessary to religion and the church. Without a devil, the only person to blame for anything bad happening would be God. The guy who's supposed to look out for us all the time would actually be the one doing all of the nasty things that happen to us, as well as all of the good things. Therefore, if we wish to believe that God is good and has our best intentions at heart, we sort of need to have a devil around to take the blame for all this stuff. It's just interesting to think that without the devil, one might be able to argue that we are the most scared of God. Not sure how I feel about that, but a cool thought experiment nonetheless. Number 5 on this list is the Templo Mayor ruins. So a church is typically defined as a place for Christian worship, but let's loosen up that definition just a little bit and start thinking about it as a building or landmark where people would have worshipped higher beings. If we start thinking about it like that, then the Templo Mayor ruins can certainly qualify. Mexico has a lot of haunted spots, but this is at the top of their list for sure. Gaurav Gupta writes, this archaeological site in Mexico has a blood-soaked past. It is a haunted Aztec civilization site that has made its presence felt throughout the time. Around 4,000 people were brutally killed to please Aztec gods. The priests would cut out the beating hearts from the victims' chests and then throw their lifeless bodies on the stairs of the Aztec temple. Aztec's last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, made his last stand invading Spanish armies before he was tortured and killed. This Aztec is now a museum, and tourists report strange sensational feelings and sightings of shadow figures. 4,000 people were likely sacrificed here. That is a truly absurd amount of sacrifices. Then throw on the fact that a great battle took place here, and you end up with so much death. Needless to say, the spirits of those that passed have never really left. Glowing orbs are always spotted at this place, especially in the evening. There have been reports of these glowing orbs touching the people and transporting them to the world of the dead. They go into a hypnotic state and can't move, sort of like what happens to people in the latest season of Stranger Things, if any of you have watched that. They have a very hard time explaining what has happened to them after the fact, but they know that it was the dead. This is accompanied by a giant beam of light that flashes into the sky. There is evil here, there just has to be. All of the death that has transpired over the years has left a horrible stain on this place, and evil has congregated here. No one knows what type of evil or what spirit is behind this, but just know that this is a scary place that you should probably avoid. Number 4 on this list is the Ness Church. Ness Church is a Norwegian church that is no longer operating. It's a collection of ruins now and a very popular spot for ghost hunters. The ghost hunters have discovered that electronic equipment, or your standard cell phone, isn't going to do so hot in this church. For whatever reason, the second that you bring anything like that in, it just completely shuts down. If one wants to have an electronic device here, then it needs to be specifically made to withstand strong spiritual energy. The most popular myth surrounding the ghostly presence that resides here is a priest named Jacob Christian Finnegan. This was a priest who presided over this church from 1800 to 1837. Apparently he suffered a very grim fate here along with his children. It's thought that he and his children were killed by an evil gang who came through the church looting it. They killed the priest and then, ever so cruelly, bricked his children up and left them to die. This is only one variation of the tale though, because one legend actually says that the priest did this to his kids himself. Regardless of which one is historically accurate, they're both pretty bad. The screams of these children are frequently accompanied by the sighting of this priest. It's said that he will stalk those who come here and follow them around, giving them a horribly uneasy feeling. It's very likely that if you go by yourself, this ghostly priest will attack you and could do some serious damage. Maybe he wasn't evil when he was alive, but he certainly is now. Number 3 on this list is Egg Hill Church. This church was home to one of the worst tragedies a church has ever been host to. I've never been a real churchgoer myself, but from my understanding, love, life, spirituality, all of this is supposed to be in the air when you go, and the whole reason for doing so. Death and hate and violence, that's all supposed to be left at the door. Pennsylvania's Egg Hill Church didn't quite do that. Instead, they invited death into the church on one particular Halloween night. Many years ago, the whole community gathered into the church on Halloween. The priest passed around bread and wine as is customary, but this bread and wine was a little off. In fact, it was very off. So off that everyone who had it died. It was poisoned. It's unknown whether the town had collectively decided to end their lives together that night or if this was all the priests doing, but either way, tens to hundreds of people's bodies lay lifeless on the ground when it was all said and done. Now, what are we left with? Well, the ghosts of all of these people, obviously. Even worse than that, the spirit of this evil priest still lingers here too, and apparently, he isn't done with the living. He's said to be very dangerous and wants to drag visitors down with him and take their life. This whole story is pretty much as dark as you can get, and it's no wonder the place is totally messed up today. Number 2 on this list is Borley Rectory. Built in 1863 in England, this is one of the most famous haunted churches in the world. We can thank the personalities of Ed and Lorraine Warren for bringing it into the spotlight, as they had quite the experience at this church back in the day. The horror stories began back in 1929. A journalist named V.C. Wall was a photographer in the woods nearby the rectory taking pictures one evening when they saw something very strange. From the outside, the rectory looked like it had a light on, but if you walked inside, it was all dark. Wall also saw the ghost of a nun that evening walking around the graveyard looking as eerie as you may expect. After they told people about this story, some ghost hunters came forward and provided an explanation. Back in the 1300s, there was a monastery here. At this monastery, a monk had a relationship with a nun. This was found out and resulted in deadly punishment for both people. The nun got it particularly bad though, because she was bricked up alive in the convent walls and left there to die. The 1929 story was the big one that kicked everything off, but after this happened, other stories started emerging. Stories about this land before the rectory was even built. Apparently this area of land was always haunted and dealing with ghostly presences. Strange rapping sounds, bells ringing, objects moving and flying lying around without anyone touching them are all very common sights at the Borley Rectory. The ghost of this nun is also a regular character here, making herself known to newcomers quite often. You may even see the ghost coach. A headless phantom coach driver is said to be around the area and will approach people every now and again and take them away. Why anyone would ever get into a coach driven by a headless ghost is beyond me, but apparently it happens. Everything about this rectory and land is evil, and it needs to be avoided. And finally, number 1 on this list is Nidaros Cathedral. This is not only Norway's most important cathedral, but also one of the most haunted as well. I mean, in all honesty, it literally looks like Dracula's castle if Dracula's castle was a cathedral. It was constructed in the 1300s, but the actual hauntings didn't begin until relatively recently in its lifetime. In 1924, Bishop Mary Gleditch saw something pretty scary and gruesome. The ghost of a monk who had a massive slash directly across his neck. Ever since that day, this monk is seen very regularly. Nobody knows why though. People and historians have looked through the history of this cathedral and can't seem to find any record of a big monk population ever staying here. However, it doesn't make sense that this random monk ghost would just show up out of nowhere, so you have to imagine that he was here at some point before. You also have to imagine that he got that cut on his neck here too. All of it is very dark and mysterious and makes you wonder what else happened here that wasn't documented. Number 5 on this list is the Old Post Chapel. This chapel is located in the Arlington, Virginia cemetery and is definitely one of the most haunted churches in the world. The Arlington Public Library writes, the Old Post Chapel was commissioned by Major George Patton Jr. in 1933 when he toured the chapels on the grounds of the Walter Reed Hospital. Patton told Post Commander Colonel Kenyon Joyce that the new chapel should combine the functions of a principal chapel with those of a mortuary chapel in one building. Workers broke ground in February 1934 and the chapel was officially dedicated on April 21, 1935, where it was known for its attractive spire and intricate stained glass windows. The chapel serves as a place of worship for the community, a wedding chapel, and a place of final honors for those laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Many fallen service members have lain in wait in the Old Post Chapel for their final trip, and it's allowed family members to grieve in private. So it's unsurprising that many active duty service members have reported hearing disembodied voices and footsteps in the chapel when they've been there alone. Locked doors have unlocked themselves and opened on their own. Canine units patrolling with service people will refuse to go into the building and bark at the door, especially at night. And visitors describe a young grief-stricken woman dressed in white who waits for her sweetheart. Rumors are that she threw herself from the bell tower, which remains locked to this day. So what really sticks out to me there, guys, about that excerpt is the canine units. Dogs not wanting to go into this place because they're scared. You ever notice how animals can get skittish when a big storm is coming or something like that? Well, they sense these things and they pick up on stuff that humans just don't. I personally imagine that they probably have a similar ability with spiritual presences or anything of that nature. Also, considering how many people have been laid to rest here, it's no wonder why this place would be as haunted as people are claiming it to be. If you're going, then definitely pray before entering, but don't be scared to just avoid it altogether either. Number 4 on this list is the Abbey de Mortemer. This abbey was a whole thriving community at one point, but now it's a total ruin of its former self. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be zeroing in on the place of worship that they had at this spot and looking at how haunted that is. And let me tell you, it's pretty freaking haunted. In the 15th century, this place was booming and one of the brightest communities in France. It really looked like it was on the come up. But fast forward 200 years later and things had really fallen off. Greed had taken over and the men who were in charge were far more interested in their personal gain than the growth of this place. People started leaving and things started to wear and tear with time. Eventually there got to a point where there were only a handful of monks still there living under the leaky roof of this abbey. Well, in 1790, they met a very grim and sick fate. This was the time of the French Revolution, and religion was very much out of favor. A group of revolutionists swept through the area, and believing that the monks had some sort of treasure hidden here, they took them into the cellar and they killed them. The manner to which these men died was brutal. Because of this, it's believed that their spirit still clings to the ruins of this place. Future owners of this location had many run-ins with ghosts and even had to perform some exorcisms in their time being there. There have also been reports of werewolves and other demonic creatures here. The monks are by far the most spotted poltergeists though. The crazy thing is that apparently they aren't that evil. One would think that after their life was so ruthlessly stripped away from them that they would harbor some anger, but apparently they don't. If you do make it out here, then I recommend you pray not only as a form of safety, but also as a sign of respect for the souls of the monks who still live here. Number 3 on this list is the couple's demon. William Hope was a paranormal investigator who lived from 1863 to 1933. During that time, he was responsible for capturing a wide array of spiritual photographs which showcase ghosts and demons. Now, after evaluating some of his work, I think it's fair to assume that some of it is doctored. I'm not sure how one man would have been able to capture all the demonic pictures that he did without potentially faking a few. That being said though, I don't think that everything he's done has been doctored, and I imagine that there are some with serious legitimacy to them. One of his most famous is of an older couple with what clearly looks to be a demon standing behind them. When they took this photo, nobody was physically there, and they could only capture this devilish creature when they looked at the film after the fact. Some other entries on this list, I mean, you might be able to classify as a ghost, but this is 100% a demon. The eyes are black and unforgiving, and it looks as if you're getting sucked into a black hole of nothingness. You can't make out this creature's lower body at all, and she's just all black. She reminds me a lot of a few urban legends of female demons appearing around the world. Their stories differ, but there are some commonalities between them all. Usually a woman appears like this to a stranger, asks them a few questions, and if they don't answer properly, will drag them to hell. I'm actually surprised that the people in this photograph managed to get out of it safely without feeling her presence or being attacked while they were there. I'm pretty sure that the church can explain this one, they just probably won't like the explanation very much. Number 2 on this list is the Borley Rectory. This is sometimes referred to as the most haunted place in all of England, so it definitely deserves a spot on our list. The Rectory, which for those who don't know is a Church of England, was built in 1863. For a bit over 50 years, nothing out of the ordinary or spectacular happened here. It was just a normal rectory. The horror stories didn't take place until 1929. A journalist named V.C. Wall was with a photographer in the woods nearby the rectory taking pictures one evening when they saw the weirdest thing. Apparently from the outside, the rectory looked as if it had a light on within it, but the second that you walked inside, that light disappeared. This phenomenon baffled both of the men, and they thought that something paranormal might be happening. Wall also reportedly said that he saw a nun that evening, or what looked to be the ghost of a nun, walking in the garden. After they told people about this story, some ghost hunters came forward and provided an explanation. Back in the 1300s, there was a monastery here. At this monastery, a monk had a relationship with a nun. This was found out and resulted in deadly punishment for both people. The nun got it particularly bad though, because she was bricked up alive in the convent walls and left there to die. The story from V.C. Wall brought this place to the public's attention, but apparently ghost stories have been told here from long before as well. Sightings of paranormal creatures have been seen and talked about dating back before the rectory was even built on this land. Clearly this whole area is just inherently cursed, and this rectory just happens to be built on it. Strange rapping sounds, bells ringing, objects moving and flying around without anybody touching them. These are all very common sightings at the Borley Rectory. The ghost of this nun is also a regular character here, making herself known to newcomers quite often. If you happen to get really lucky, then you may also see a ghost coach with 2 horses and a headless coachman. Maybe lucky is kind of the wrong word to use here, but this sighting is a lot rarer and doesn't come out to everybody. Either way, the Borley Rectory is way too haunted and should probably just be avoided at all costs. And finally, number 1 on this list is St. Paul's Episcopal Church. This church and the grounds that it resides on is haunted by a number of different ghouls. It's located in the Florida Keys and has seen many a tragedy in its days. Whether it be a hurricane, a great fire, or other natural disasters, this church has pretty much been through it all. Ghosts and Gravestones writes, "The most well-known haunt of St. Paul's Church Cemetery is that of a man in 19th century attire who appears as a flimsy white vapor. Many believe that it's the spirit of Fleming himself who seems upset. Is it because his gravesite was disturbed so many times throughout the years by all the reconstructions? Nobody knows for sure, but his apparition has startled many. Another spirit that seems to roam the graveyard is a sea captain who appears to take great pleasure in frightening visitors. And beware of the ghost of a man who was legendary for driving the pirates out of Key West. His spirit is angry and ready to taunt, and those who've encountered his apparition say that even on a day when the weather is calm, violent winds come rushing through a tree that sits right next to his grave." John Fleming, the ghost that they talk about there, was the initial owner of this land and died on the property. His wife donated said land to be used for the church, but apparently her husband's spirit never left. The story behind the sea captain is unknown. Why he's come here or what happened to him is all a mystery. One thing is for sure though, he is a very dangerous ghost, and many visitors have reported being assaulted and terrified by him. This is definitely one of those churches that I would again avoid altogether, but if you do go, then make sure you say a prayer before entering.
Coming in at number 5, we have the Vatican Secret Archives. The Vatican Secret Archives is considered to be the world's most secure building, but why is it so locked down? What secrets are being hidden behind the walls? The amount of history located there is immense. The Vatican Secret Archives is home to the largest collection of Catholic books, documents, and doctrine in the world. It boasts letters from well-known figures such as Abraham Lincoln and Mary, Queen of Scots. It contains 53 miles of shelving with 35,000 volumes in the selective catalogue alone. The archives also include state papers, correspondence, account books, and many other documents the church has acquired over the centuries. Naturally, many people have speculated that there must be secret documents amongst the 50+ miles of shelving in the Vatican's archives. Of course, no one is allowed to browse the archives, which makes it even more mysterious. Only select scholars, academics, and journalists are allowed to enter, and this is a rule that will never likely change. Many believe that the Pope and many people around him keep very classified and secret information in the archives that they don't want the world knowing. One theory is that the archives contains correspondence between St. Paul and Emperor Nero pertaining to Jesus' existence and his biological descendants, and some believe that the Vatican may be hiding proof that Jesus did in fact exist or didn't exist at all. Next is the confirmation and evidence of alien life forms such as extraterrestrial skulls. Some claim that in 1998 skulls with elongated heads and small faces resembling aliens were found underneath the Vatican. Ever since, the Vatican has kept all evidence of aliens a secret to not discredit Christianity. Another secret being held from the world is the Grand Grimoire, which is an alleged medieval book that is believed to possess immense powers. It was written in the 16th century by Honorius of Thebes, who claimed to be possessed by the devil himself. In the book, it has instructions on how to make magic talismans and amulets, how to make magic spells, and even how to summon demons, and even offers instructions on how to summon the devil himself and make a deal with him. If the Vatican is keeping world-shattering secrets in its archives, we may never know due to its high level of security, and it only being accessible to a slight few. So our questions of what is really in there may never be answered. In at number 4, we have the Church of Rome. Destruction of important Jewish historical documentation. In 1415, the Church of Rome took an extraordinary step to destroy all knowledge of the 2 2nd-century Jewish books that is said contained the true name of Jesus Christ. The Antipope Benedict XIII firstly signalled out for condemnation a secret Latin treatise called Ma Jesu, and then issued instructions to destroy all of the copies of the Book of Alexei. No editions of these writings now publicly exist, but church archives recorded that they were once in popular circulation and known to early presbyters. Knowledge of these writings survived from quotations made by Bishop Hippolytus of Rome and Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, along with references in some early traditions of the Talmud of Palestine and Babylonia. The rabbinic fraternity once held the destroyed manuscripts with great reference, for they were comprehensive of original records reporting of the life of Rabbi Jesus. Later, in a similar manner, Pope Alexander VI ordered all copies of Talmud destroyed. The Council of the Inquisition required as many Jewish writings as possible to burn with the Spanish Grand Inquisitor. Thomas de Torquemada, responsible for the elimination of 6,000 volumes at Salamanca. In 1550, Cardinal Carafe, the Inquisitor General, repealed all previous permission for priests to read the Talmud, which he said contained hostile stories about Jesus Christ, leading him to seize every copy he could find in Rome and burn them. Solomon Romano also burnt many thousands of Hebrew scrolls, and in 1559 every Hebrew book in the city of Prague was confiscated. The mass destruction of Jewish books included hundreds of copies of the Old Testament and caused irreversible loss of many original handwritten documents. The mass destruction of Jewish writings, the church overlooked two particular British documents that still exist to this day in the British Museum. Coming in at number 3, we have the Orphans of Duplessis. In the 1930s and 1940s in Quebec City was marred by unprecedented acts of corruption and repression due to a conservative revolution better known as the Great Darkness, which was led by Premier Maurice Duplessis, and many of the acts were involving the Catholic Church. In 1940, the Duplessis government and along with the Catholic Church began to diagnose orphan children with mental problems, even though these children were perfectly healthy. Due to this, thousands of orphan children were sent to a psychiatric institution of the church so that the church could receive a government subsidy for the treatment of these children. Unfortunately, this was a reality for so many because mental health wasn't as widely known as today, and it was unknown how to treat those suffering back then. At this time, many orphanages were converted into asylums for children, and more than 20,000 were misdiagnosed and imprisoned in asylums so that the Catholic Church could earn more money. According to reports, many of these children weren't orphans at all, but children coming from single mothers who were forcibly taken into church custody, and they didn't admit children out of wedlock. The people forced to be involved in this were subjected to nightmares, including drug testing and other medical experiments like electric shock therapy. In the 1990s, almost 3,000 survivors of the Duplessis orphan scandal revealed the horrific events they had to go through, but the government made a sad excuse of a settlement with the victims, and the Catholic Church remained silent to stifle the scandal. In at number 2, we have Joan of Arc. Most people know the story of Joan of Arc. She is mostly considered a hero of France for her role during the war. She is now considered a saint, but the Catholic Church hated her. She claimed that she was receiving messages from God, instructions on what she should do to help her people. This angered many higher-ranking officials within the church. Joan saw her first vision around the age of 13 in 1425. The figure she identified as Saint Michael, surrounded by angels, appeared in her garden. After receiving the vision, she wept as she wanted to go with him. Throughout her life, she continued to be visited and given messages from the Lord. By 1428, Joan's visions told her she must leave her home and go to France. Since then, she gained followers and support in her fight to recover France from English domination. The Catholic Church denounced her visions and set out to take her down. In 1430, Joan was captured. She was put on trial for heresy, even though Joan was a devout Christian. They gave Joan as many charges as they could, hoping she would be found guilty of at least one of them. The military were relieved of her capture. They believed her to have supernatural powers. They feared her as it was not typical for women to wield such power and command. One of the most well-known charges against Joan was that she wore men's clothing, something apparently illegal back then. In reality, this came from the fact that she wore armor while in enemy territory, something not seen as being ladylike for the time. The trial was not conventional for the time. It was clear no matter what she did, they were determined to find her guilty. Although she was impressive during the trial, she was ultimately found guilty. She was found guilty of heresy and sentenced to death. She was to be burned at the stake. Joan is seen as a hero and a saint today. The Catholic Church tries to distance themselves from her mistreatment. And finally, in at number 1, we have the Vatican's quest for aliens. It might surprise you to know that the Catholic Church has a keen interest in aliens. They hold a conference each year to talk about astrobiology. If you haven't heard that term before, it's a term they created to make their meetings about aliens seem more legitimate. The Vatican has often defended itself in the public about their interest in extraterrestrial. As they often state, evolution is not something they believe in. You would assume they also didn't believe in aliens. The Vatican even has its own team of scientists looking into the existence of these beings and attempting to make contact. The chief astronomer stated, "There is no conflict between believing in God and in the possibility of extraterrestrial brothers, perhaps more evolved than humans." He went on to explain that you cannot put limits on God's creative freedom, so it makes sense after creating Earth he would go to create other beings. Some even believe that humans are lost sheep of the universe, and we need to find the more evolved of God's creations. All of this would not be such a surprise if they hadn't condemned science since the creation of the church. In the 17th century, they condemned the astronomer Galileo for insisting that the Earth revolved around the sun. It seems they had progressed in some of their beliefs since then. Some believe that they spent a lot of money on their exploration into space and have even discovered a few things that they are keeping to themselves. Some historians believe that within the Vatican Vatican secret archive there is evidence of contact with extraterrestrials. It is not known why they would keep this information from the world. Do they want to use it to further their beliefs, or maybe they don't consider everyone to be worthy? We do know there are stories of communication with other beings, but the information is mostly kept with the church. In 1917, 3 children saw the Virgin Mary, who gave them a telepathic message. The message was that we are not alone on the planet. They warned that humanity needs to prepare for their return. The Catholic Church censored these messages. The only person who knew the full content of the message was the Pope, who refused to release the details of all 3. This is just one instance of messages received on Earth that have been held by the Vatican for years. It is believed they have no intention to release this information. The archive is heavily guarded. Who knows what could be hidden within their findings?
Number 5 on this list is the Lady of Guadalupe Church. This church is located in New Orleans and is known to the locals as being one of the most haunted spots in the whole city. This location hasn't always acted as a place of worship, but for a long time was a chapel that you really didn't want to end up at. That's because for the longest time it was actually called the Old Mortuary Church. As I'm sure that you can probably guess, the crowd that entered this place wasn't the liveliest. In fact, using the word live to describe them is just flat out incorrect. New Orleans was hit hard many a time with epidemics, with yellow fever being especially bad. There were times during the city's history where the dead were too many to handle and they had to go somewhere. Enter in the Old Mortuary Church. Thousands upon thousands of bodies have went through these doors over the years. In fact, for the longest time, the only people this place saw were the pastors who were here and the countless dead. Everyday citizens were too scared to come here for fear of catching the disease and wouldn't even risk going to see their departed loved ones. Obviously, all this death has left its ghostly mark. Eventually, it was turned into a full-fledged church that people attend, but not before the spiritual damage had been done. Nowadays, the spirits of some of those who died during this harsh period in New Orleans history still haunt the area. Glowing orbs have been seen by those who frequent the church, floating around at nighttime. Subtle and faint moans can be heard echoing throughout the walls, as if the moans themselves were wind blowing through the church. The ghost of a man has said to approach people from time to time, claiming he needs help and that he was never sick to begin with. This is definitely one of those churches who's seen its fair share of tragedy over the years, and it shows. However, believe it or not, it may not be the most haunted church in New Orleans, but more on that later. Number 4 on this list is St. Helena's Chapel of Ease. This chapel is located in South Carolina and is a ruin of its former self. A website all about Beaufort, South Carolina writes, "The chapel was destroyed in a horrendous forest fire that happened after the Civil War. Today, the ruins of the chapel and a graveyard remain. The vault still remains out of order to this very day. The planters left St. Helena with the arrival of Union forces in 1861, and the church never regained its stature. Some stories relate that Union soldiers used it for services during the war, as well as Northerners who came to the area after the war to educate and train the former slave population. The door of the Fripp's vault was ruined by the soldiers, and at some point it was decided to brick up the entrance. According to the story, workmen did a very good job of sealing the vault, only to return the following day to find the bricks removed and neatly stacked beside the mausoleum. This had occurred many times. Convinced that the supernatural was at work, the job remained unfinished. Local authorities had assured that no one had been in the area the previous night long enough to complete such a task. Today, the vault remains empty. The door is half sealed by bricks. One might find the experience of looking into the vacant vault more than a bit unsettling, if not downright eerie. Ever since that moment, regular ghostly sightings have been reported here. A woman dressed in 18th century clothing carrying a child through the graveyard is one of the most frequent apparitions that takes form. People have also talked about hearing people singing here even though they'll be completely by themselves. Usually these songs sound like church songs and are quite beautiful actually. Also, just a general feeling of uneasiness has been reported at this spot very often. This place clearly has a very strong spiritual presence, and I'd highly recommend giving a prayer before entering it. Number 3 on this list is the Pink Lady. In Greencastle, Indiana, there's a massive mansion called the O'Hara Mansion. The pictures in question are by a man named Guy Winters who was investigating said mansion several years ago. This mansion is abandoned and has been for some time, and the locals like to keep it that way. Apparently they have believed for quite some time that some sort of demonic entity lives there and watches over the grounds. It's thought that trespassing on them could endanger your life. This didn't deter Guy Winters and his friend Terry, who wanted to find out for themselves if there really was some sort of evil presence here. They went into the mansion and stayed there for several days and nights with cameras documenting everything. What they found was the Pink Lady, a vaporous pink demon that Guy Winters was able to snap on photograph. Apparently, as is with most of this demon photography, Guy didn't actually see the apparition in real life, but it was only noticed after the picture was developed. This apparition definitely looks like something evil if you ask me. It almost looks like a demon witch, if that's even a thing, but certainly something that has the intention of possessing you or consuming your soul. This picture went along with a bunch of weird occurrences at this place too. Apparently the two boys were perpetually on edge and kept having strange things happen to them. Things would move without them touching them, the temperature in the rooms would change drastically. They both talked about having a voice in their head that they weren't familiar with, something that had them starting to become convinced that they were losing their minds. They might not have known it at the time, but it seems like all of these things can be chalked up to the work of the Pink Lady. Number 2 on this list is St. Louis Cathedral. So we already talked about the Lady of Guadalupe Church, but the only reason that church even exists is because of the St. Louis Church. Also located in New Orleans and arguably more haunted than the previous one. This church is interesting because one could argue that it's been around a lot longer than the other New Orleans one, but that also isn't necessarily true. That's because this is actually the 4th church to go up on this spot. 3 previous times the church that was here has suffered serious damage that caused it to get replaced. One was from a hurricane that swept through the entire area and totally knocked the church to the ground. One was by a raging fire, and one was simply by wear and tear of being around for so many years. It was during one of the times that this place was in disrepair that other church was built. Along with these incidents, it should also be noted that the church used to be used to bury some of New Orleans' prominent figures. So when you walk through this church, you're literally walking over a ton of graves in the process. Through the deep history this church has, it's no wonder that ghostly sightings are a regular here. Perhaps the most famous ghost associated with St. Louis Cathedral is that of Père Antoine. Pierre was a Spanish Capuchin friar at the St. Louis Cathedral. He arrived in New Orleans in 1774 and was named pastor. His generosity and kindness to the people of New Orleans made him very popular. He was well liked by all of New Orleans. His death on January 19, 1829 was met with a somber and mourning city. He was laid to rest inside the St. Louis Cathedral 3 days after his death. Since his death in 1829, the ghost of Père Antoine has been seen in St. Louis Cathedral by an untold number of people. His ghost is easily recognized as there's a portrait of him inside the cathedral. It seems as if the ghost of Père Antoine especially likes to show himself around the holiday seasons. Commonly, the ghost of Père Antoine is seen near the altar and on the balconies. So guys, what I just read is from an article written by Ghost City Tours describing how serious this haunting is at this church. Apparently Père Antoine isn't the only ghost either, but people have reported seeing the ghost of another pastor and some other apparitions of what looks to be people from the 1700s. Clearly something about a New Orleans church is very attractive to the paranormal. And finally, number 1 on this list is the Abbey of the Black Hag. This church would be a tad bit difficult to pray before entering because there isn't too much left to enter. It's located in Ireland and is a ruin of its former self. The story starts many hundreds of years ago when this place was referred to as St. Catherine's Augustine Abbey. This place was established in 1298 and was pretty great right up until the last abbess took over. It's said that this woman practiced witchcraft here and brought great evil to the others that lived here and those nearby. Pope Martin V caught wind of this and ordered the immediate closure of this place. Everybody left, except for the witch. She stayed here completely by herself, practicing magic all day and all night. Eventually, through her consistent spell practicing and probably the fact that she never bathed ever, her skin blackened to such a degree that people started referring to this place as the Abbey of the Black Hag. Apparently this witch still resides here to this day, and the locals fear going here and risking her wrath. Tales have been told of livestock going missing, weird symbols appearing in the ground, and even the occasional child wandering into this area, never to be heard from again. I feel like praying before you go to a place like this might not actually help that much. In fact, I'd just try avoiding it altogether if I was you.